Moving to a new town is never easy, especially when you've spent your whole life in a city like Philly. The urban heartbeat, the familiar streets, and the friends I'd known since childhood were hard to leave behind. But when my family decided to relocate an hour outside the city, I didn't have much choice. It was a world apart from what I was used to, less chaotic, more rural. The kind of place where kids grew up knowing everyone, for better or worse. Adapting wasn't optional, it was a necessity. My father, a man of few but firm words, made it clear, keep my head down, stay out of trouble, and focus on the future. My mother, ever the family's emotional core, insisted I make the best of it. The area was a patchwork of cultures, some black, some Hispanic, a few Italian and Jewish families sprinkled in, but the majority were hard-headed German Lutherans who ran everything. They weren't Amish or Mennonite, but they were every bit as set in their ways. Despite this mix, it didn't take long for me to blend in, even if I still longed for the camaraderie of my Philly friends. After graduating, I stayed in the area, mainly to keep close to my family. My ties to Philly weren't completely severed. I made regular trips back to visit my old friends and neighborhood, keeping those connections alive. It was during this time that I got my first job, driving a fuel oil delivery truck. The work was straightforward, and I liked it well enough. Over time, I worked my way into the office, handling dispatch and customer orders. I had a knack for the business, and for the first time, I could envision a future where I wasn't just an employee but an owner of my own operation. Socially, things were better than I expected. Making friends wasn't hard, and meeting women came even easier. When I eventually married Marcy, my mother had mixed feelings. She wasn't Italian, and that mattered to her. Still, she did her best to welcome Marcy into the family, and for a while, it seemed to work. Marcy and I had 2 kids, and after that, she insisted I get a vasectomy. I didn't put up much of a fight, it seemed like a practical decision. But once our boys were in school, Marcy decided she wanted to go back to work. My father always thought a mother's place was in the home, a sentiment that made more sense to me as I got older. I wasn't thrilled about Marcy working, not because I didn't want her to, but because of the crowd she'd inevitably reconnect with, people from her past that I'd always found insufferable. Marcy had always been active in school clubs and social events, something I avoided like the plague. To me, those people were just a bunch of self-important snobs, patting each other on the back. I knew Marcy had a history before me, hell, we all have one, but we never talked about it. It wasn't a rule, it just never came up. We had been married for about 10 years when things started to unravel. At first, it was subtle, extra hours at work, weekend shifts, and too many excuses. By the time she announced a 3-day seminar, my suspicions had crystallized. The moment Marcy brought up the seminar, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. "It's only for 3 days, Tony," she said, her tone casual, almost rehearsed. "I already talked to your mom, and she agreed to stay with the kids while I'm gone. You'll be home in the evenings, you can manage, right?" She spoke as if it were a done deal, but I wasn't having it. I could barely believe she even had the audacity to ask. "Who's going on this seminar?" I asked, keeping my voice steady, though I could feel the heat rising in my chest. She hesitated for just a fraction of a second before responding. 6 girls from the department, Betty Klink from personnel, and Rodney. Rodney. That name hit me like a sucker punch. She said it with a little too much pep in her voice, her eyes lighting up just enough to confirm my worst fears. I smiled, but it wasn't out of kindness. It was disbelief. Did she really think I was that stupid? For months, I had pieced things together, the extra lunches, the late-night work sessions, the unmistakable look she had when Rodney was around. They'd grown up together, part of the same insufferable group of club joiners who thought they were better than the rest of us. And now, her boss was a little too involved in her life for my liking. "Do you think I'm an idiot, Marcy?" I said, the tension breaking through my forced calm. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice suddenly defensive. I let it all out. "I've known about you and Rodney for 6 months now. If you think I'm going to let you go away with him for 3 days, you're out of your damn mind." Her face froze for a moment before she fired back. Tony, that's ridiculous. He's my boss. There's nothing going on between us. I would never cheat on you. You know that. Her words were sharp, but her eyes betrayed her, darting away from mine just a little too quickly. I stared at the empty Budweiser can in my hand, then crushed it with a single squeeze. As I got up and walked to the kitchen, I tossed it toward the trash can, missing completely but not caring enough to pick it up. The sound of the fresh can hissing open echoed in the silence as I returned to my chair. She just sat there, waiting for my reply, her shoulders stiff and her expression caught between defiance and guilt. You're the mother of my children, and you've done a good job in that role, I began slowly. The only reason I haven't thrown you out is because of them. I talked to my mom. She said I should stay firm and hope you get whatever this is out of your system for the sake of the kids. But make no mistake, Marcy, if I dump you, the courts will hand you my boys, and I can't let that happen. Her face twisted in shock. You told your mother I was cheating on you? No, I said, taking a long swig of beer. One of her friends from church told her. I just didn't deny it when she asked. You're not serious, she stammered, her voice cracking. You can't believe this nonsense. Oh, I believe it. Rodney lives 3 blocks from your office at 321 David Drive. I know you and your boss go there 3 times a week. You stay for about 3 hours each time. So tell me, Marcy, what exactly do you do at his apartment for 3 hours? And while you're at it, explain all this overtime you've been logging at the office. Her eyes filled with tears, and her lips quivered as the weight of my words sank in. She had no answer, just silence and guilt written all over her face. Here's the deal, I said, my tone final. As long as you don't embarrass me or my family in public, I won't do anything drastic. But if that changes, all bets are off. You can leave, or you can stay, but you'll never take my boys from me. She exploded out of her chair, tears streaming down her face. Damn you, Tony. I hate you. And with that, she stormed out of the room, leaving me alone with my thoughts, my beer, and the crushing realization of what my life had become. That night marked a turning point in our marriage, a descent into something colder than just distance. From then on, we became little more than 2 strangers sharing a roof. I moved into the spare bedroom, a cramped little catch-all space that felt more like a storage closet than a proper room. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and I'd rather sleep there than in the bed where I no longer felt welcome. We were renting the house at the time, saving up for a dream home that now felt like a cruel joke. The $60,000 we had set aside was supposed to be our foundation for a brighter future. Instead, it sat untouched, a reminder of dreams that had turned into a nightmare. Marcy dropped the seminar idea without another word. The overtime at work stopped, and she started packing her lunches instead of eating out. Outwardly, things appeared to settle, but inside the house, the air was icy, heavy with unspoken accusations and unaddressed tension. The silence was deafening. There was no intimacy, not even the casual familiarity of shared routines. The boys, Terry and Rick, were blissfully unaware of what was happening between us. I tried to keep it that way, for their sake, but every time I looked at them, I felt a pang of guilt. Was this the environment I wanted to raise them in? Against my better judgment, I agreed to accompany Marcy to her company's Christmas party. At first, I wanted to refuse, but the thought of her going alone, especially with Rodney lurking around, was unbearable. I figured I could endure a few hours of awkwardness for the sake of appearances and to keep an eye on her. The company had rented a hall, complete with a buffet, open bars, and a dance floor. By the time we arrived, the only seats left were near the bigwigs, an area everyone else seemed to avoid like the plague. I kept a low profile, nursing my beers and avoiding small talk. Several of Marcy's coworkers asked her to dance, and I didn't mind letting her go. I wasn't much of a dancer, and it was easier to watch from a distance. For a while, everything seemed fine. Then I noticed it, small, almost imperceptible glances exchanged across the room. Marcy and Rodney weren't saying a word to each other, but their eyes were doing all the talking. A nod here, a head tilt there, it was subtle, but unmistakable. I stayed calm, outwardly at least. But my heart was pounding, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. Eventually, Marcy excused herself to use the restroom. That's when I noticed Rodney slipping away as well. My stomach sank. It was stupid, reckless even. If they were meeting up, why do it here, in the middle of a company party, with me just a few feet away? The only explanation was that they wanted to humiliate me, to flaunt their little affair right under my nose. I scanned the room quickly and realized Rodney's buddies were grinning like they'd just heard the punchline of some cruel joke. My blood boiled, but I kept my composure. I followed them quietly, making my way toward the restrooms. What I found confirmed everything I already knew. In the men's room, Rodney had his hands all over my wife. They were kissing, and his hand was up her skirt. There was no resistance from Marcy, she was fully complicit. I saw red. Without thinking, I grabbed Rodney by the back of the neck and slammed his head into the tile wall. The sickening crunch of his nose breaking was oddly satisfying. Marcy was screaming my name, but I barely heard her. I spun Rodney around, blood pouring from his face, and gave him a hard punch to the stomach. He doubled over, vomiting onto the floor as he collapsed. Dragging him by his tie, I hauled him out into the middle of the party. The music stopped, and the room went silent as everyone stared. I dropped Rodney onto the floor like a sack of garbage and turned to face the crowd. "Sorry for ruining your great party," I said loudly, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "I'm leaving now, but I'm leaving my wife here, for your entertainment. Drop her off at the house when you're done using her." The room was still as I walked out, but not before giving Rodney one final kick, square in the groin. His groan of pain was the last thing I heard before the door closed behind me. In the car, I called my mom. I needed her to come pick up the boys. I wasn't sure what I was going to do next, but I knew I needed to get away for a few days. I drove home in silence, gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My mind raced with anger, humiliation, and the overwhelming need to put as much distance as I could between myself and the wreckage of my marriage. By the time I got home, my mom was already there, her arms around the boys, doing her best to keep everything normal for them. I paid the babysitter and helped pack up the kids for the night. "Mom," I said quietly, "I need a few days. Just make sure the boys are okay." She nodded, not pressing for details. She knew better than anyone how much I hated airing my dirty laundry, even with family. Upstairs, I grabbed a bag and tossed in the basics: socks, underwear, a few shirts. Before I left, I retrieved the cash box I'd hidden in the basement rafters. The banks weren't paying squat in interest back then, so I kept our savings, $62,000 for a down payment on a house, and cash at home. It wasn't the smartest idea, but at least it was all there when I needed it. Just as I was about to head out, a cab pulled up, and Marcy stumbled in. She looked worried, not angry or defensive, just scared. For a split second, I thought she might apologize or try to explain herself, but all she did was sit on the couch, staring at her hands. I didn't give her the chance to speak. "There was one rule, Marcy," I said flatly. "Don't humiliate me or our family in public. And you couldn't even do that. You had to rub my nose in it, right there in front of everyone." She didn't argue or deny anything. Tears started streaming down her face, and her voice cracked as she tried to speak. But I didn't wait to hear it. "Save it," I said, slinging the bag over my shoulder. "I'm gone for a few days. Don't mess this up even more by dragging the boys into it." I walked out before she could say another word, the door slamming shut behind me. The drive to Atlantic City was a blur. I wasn't sure if I wanted to gamble, drink, or just stare at the ocean and forget everything. All I knew was that I needed to get away. But first, I had to make a pit stop. There was a guy in my old neighborhood, a friend named S., who ran a little sandwich shop. It wasn't the fancy kind you'd see in travel guides, just a corner joint where the locals hung out. His real income came from other endeavors, the kind of business most people turned a blind eye to, but everyone knew existed. When I walked in, S greeted me like no time had passed. I didn't even have to explain. He could see it all over my face. "Tony," he said, pulling me into the back room, "what's going on?" I gave him the short version, sparing no detail about Rodney or Marcy's betrayal. S listened quietly, nodding as I spoke, then leaned back in his chair. "Tony, this is gonna cost you," he said matter-of-factly. 20 grand. You okay with that, or do you need me to spot you?" "I got it," I said without hesitation. "You want it messy, or you want it quiet?" he asked, lighting a cigarette. "Quiet," I replied. "I don't want a mess, just something simple and clean." S grinned. "You're in luck. I've got a way to make this all go away for a bit. 6 days, 7 nights at the Taj. You'll have your alibi, and nobody will ever know." I nodded. It sounded like a good plan. "Are you going alone?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yeah," I said. "This is all spur of the moment." "Bad idea," he said, shaking his head. "You need someone with you, someone to vouch that you were there the whole time." "Hold on." He picked up the phone and dialed. "Carla, it's S. Get your ass down here. You're going on vacation." I recognized the name instantly. Carla was S's niece, a girl I hadn't seen since she was a teenager. Back then, she was all giggles and baby fat, but when she walked in, I hardly recognized her. The baby fat was gone, and in its place was a confident, stunning young woman with dark eyes that sparkled like a mischievous secret. "Tony needs company in Atlantic City," S said. "You up for it?" Carla hesitated, glancing at me. "Aren't you married?" "The marriage is dead," S cut in before I could speak. "Tony just needs a friend right now, nothing else." She thought about it, then smiled. "All right, Tony. But you'd better buy me some saltwater taffy." For the first time in days, I smiled back. Maybe this trip wouldn't be so bad after all. The drive to Atlantic City was uneventful, but Carla kept it interesting. As soon as we were on the road, she insisted on getting the full rundown of everything that had happened with Marcy. I hesitated at first, but there was something about her, maybe her open, non-judgmental demeanor, that made it easier to talk. I laid it all out, sparing none of the ugly details. When I finished, Carla frowned and muttered, "Poor kids." That was all she said. She didn't badmouth Marcy, didn't offer advice, just left it at that. It felt strangely comforting. When we got to the Taj Mahal, the suite S had arranged was better than anything I'd ever stayed in. It had 2 beds, but Carla raised an eyebrow when she saw them. "Double beds, huh?" she said, smirking. I couldn't help chuckling a little, thinking that by the end of the week, we probably wouldn't need both. The first night, I kept things strictly polite. We grabbed dinner, played some slots, and took a long walk on the boardwalk. Carla seemed content with the simple things, quarter machines, saltwater taffy, and taking in the ocean air. I stuck to a few low-stakes games myself, knowing full well the house always wins. But by the second day, something shifted. It was noon, and we were back in the room, getting ready for lunch, when Carla made the first move. Before I knew it, the carefully polite boundaries we'd set dissolved, and we were tearing up the sheets like a couple of teenagers. For the first time in years, I felt alive, free from the weight of Marcy's betrayal and the suffocating coldness of our marriage. My mother had always told me to marry an Italian girl. She'd said it as a joke sometimes, but now, lying there with Carla's dark eyes looking into mine, I couldn't help thinking she'd been right. The week flew by. We gambled a little, saw every show we could fit in, and spent hours walking up and down the boardwalk. We kept a low profile but made sure to leave a trail of receipts, meals, room service, a few casino cash advances. It wasn't just a vacation, it was my alibi, meticulously planned to make sure no one could question where I was. On the 4th day, we were getting ready for dinner when there was a knock at the door. 2 men in sports jackets stood there, their faces unreadable. "Tony Randazzo," the taller one said. "I'm Ray Fritz, and this is my partner Rupert Marks. We're with the Berks County Special Crimes Task Force. Do you mind if we talk?" Carla walked out of the bathroom, wearing nothing but her robe. She froze for a moment, glancing at the two men before calmly grabbing her clothes and stepping back inside. I crossed my arms, leaning against the doorframe. "What's this about?" Fritz spoke first. "We'd like to ask you a few questions about Rodney Foote." I couldn't help the smirk that crept across my face. "Rodney? I don't have a relationship with him. My wife does." They both shifted uncomfortably. Fritz cleared his throat and continued, "We understand there was an altercation between you two at your wife's company Christmas party." "Let me guess," I said, cutting him off. "Rodney's pressing charges?" "No," Fritz admitted, glancing at Marks. "He's missing. He was last seen leaving the hospital Sunday morning in a cab. Nobody's seen him since." I shrugged, keeping my expression neutral. "Gentlemen, I've been in Atlantic City since Friday night. The hotel staff can confirm that. Now, if you don't mind, Carla and I have dinner reservations, and I'd hate to be late for a good steak." Marks finally spoke, his voice gruff. "We'll need to talk again when you're back in town." "Sure," I said, nodding as I guided them out the door. "But until then, enjoy Atlantic City." That evening at the Safari Steakhouse, Carla leaned across the table, her eyes sparkling with amusement. "So, are we officially fugitives now?" I chuckled, cutting into my steak. "Not unless they find a way to pin something on me." She smiled but didn't press further. Whatever doubts or questions she had, she kept to herself. It was one of the many things I appreciated about her. Carla knew when to push and when to leave well enough alone. The rest of the trip passed without incident, and by the time we returned home, I felt like a new man. The boys were thrilled with the saltwater taffy I'd brought back, and my mom gave me a knowing look as I handed off the souvenirs. Marcy, on the other hand, barely said a word. She looked hollow, defeated, as though she didn't know how to face me anymore. Part of me wanted to feel bad for her, but I couldn't. Not after everything. That night, after the boys were in bed, she finally worked up the nerve to ask, "What did you do with Rodney?" That night, as I sat at the kitchen table nursing a beer, Marcy stood by the sink, pretending to clean something that didn't need cleaning. She kept glancing at me, her nervous energy filling the room. Finally, she worked up the courage to speak. "What did you do with Rodney?" she asked, her voice trembling. The question didn't surprise me, but it pissed me off nonetheless. I took a slow sip of beer, letting the silence hang for a moment before answering. "I was in Atlantic City all week," I said, my tone calm but cold. "I haven't seen Rodney since the party." "You heard him," she said, her voice cracking. "He was in the hospital for 2 days. You broke his jaw and his nose." I shrugged, not denying it. "He deserved it." Marcy's face crumpled, and for a moment I thought she might break down. But instead, she straightened up, wringing her hands as she avoided my gaze. "What were you doing with him in the men's room, Marcy?" I asked, my voice cutting through the silence like a blade. She froze, staring at the floor. "Why did he have his hand up your skirt?" I pressed. "Explain that to me." She didn't answer. Instead, she stared at the table, her hands twisting together like she was trying to wring the truth out of them. "Why aren't you at work?" I asked, switching gears. "And why are the boys home on a school day?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I had to quit my job. I couldn't go back there after everything. And I took the boys out of school because your mom said you might be home today." I leaned back in my chair, letting her words sink in. For a moment, I felt a flicker of pity for her, but it was quickly snuffed out by the memory of her and Rodney in that restroom. "I gave you one rule, Marcy," I said, my voice hardening. "Don't humiliate me or our family." That was it. One rule. And you couldn't even manage that. She flinched but stayed silent. "I want to know why," I demanded, slamming my fist on the table. The sound echoed through the kitchen, making her jump. "Why did you feel the need to ruin everything? What was the point of rubbing it in my face?" Tears welled up in her eyes, and for a moment, she looked like she might crack. But when she finally spoke, her words made even less sense than her actions. "I don't know why," she said, her voice breaking. "It just happened. You were sitting there at the party, looking so out of place, and we thought," she trailed off, shaking her head. "We thought we could get away with it. I never imagined you'd react like that. I was scared, Tony. You acted like a madman." Her words only fueled my anger. "You didn't think I'd react? You didn't think I'd notice? You two had weeks to sneak around before the party, and I never would have known. But no, you just had to humiliate me in front of everyone." Marcy said nothing, her tears falling silently as she stared at the table. "You have three choices," I said finally, my voice cold and measured. "You can stay here and be a proper mother to your children. You can get a divorce and leave without the kids. Or you can disappear entirely. But if you stay, we're done. No more playing house, no more pretending. And if I catch you sneaking around with Rodney or anyone else, I swear I'll make you regret it." At the mention of Rodney's name, she burst into tears and bolted from the room, sobbing uncontrollably. I didn't follow her. Whatever sympathy I might have felt for her was buried under the weight of her betrayal. That night, I moved forward with my plan. I found a small apartment nearby and started making arrangements to separate our lives as much as possible. The house would remain the boys' home, and I'd be close enough to see them whenever they needed me. Marcy, for her part, seemed to accept the new arrangement without protest. She stayed in the house with the boys, played the part of a good mother, and kept her distance from me. I made sure she had enough money to cover the household expenses, but no more than that. Our marriage was over, even if the paperwork hadn't caught up yet. The arrangement worked well enough, but it was far from ideal. I got a small apartment a few blocks from the house, close enough that Terry and Rick could visit whenever they wanted. They were my priority, everything else came second. Marcy, to her credit, stepped up as a mother. The house was always clean, the boys were well fed, and they never missed a day of school. She kept herself busy, spending time with her parents and sister, but it was clear that her social life was non-existent. Rodney had vanished, both from her life and from the community. Rumors about him swirled, of course. Some people said he'd moved away, others whispered darker theories. None of it mattered to me. What mattered was that he was gone, and as far as I could tell, Marcy wasn't seeing anyone else. She didn't even bring up the idea of getting a new job. It was like she was retreating into herself, as if trying to make penance for what she'd done. Despite the uneasy truce, life wasn't without complications. I saw the boys every day, had dinner with them most nights, and spent weekends making sure they got my undivided attention. Marcy and I avoided any conversations that might lead to conflict. We didn't talk about the party, about Rodney, or about what had become of our marriage. And then there was Carla. At first, she'd just been a comforting presence, someone to help me navigate the aftermath of Marcy's betrayal. But as time went on, our relationship grew deeper. She moved into my apartment, and we found a strange kind of happiness together. The boys adjusted to her presence better than I'd expected. They never called her mom, but they treated her with respect and warmth, which was more than I could have hoped for. Carla wasn't perfect, but she was honest and steady in a way that Marcy had never been. She handled the household finances, using the credit cards I gave her sparingly and responsibly. She didn't ask for much and seemed genuinely invested in building a life with me. Meanwhile, Marcy stayed in the house, doing her best to keep things normal for the boys. We kept up the charade for years, pretending everything was fine for their sake. But as the boys grew older, they started to notice the cracks in the facade. The breaking point came when Terry was 16. A new kid at school, one of Rodney's relatives, started taunting him about what had happened years ago. I hadn't realized how much of the story had leaked out into the community, but apparently, enough people knew to give this kid ammunition. It didn't end well. Terry beat the kid so badly he ended up in the hospital, and Rick, trying to back up his older brother, got himself punched in the face, losing 2 teeth in the process. I got a call from the school, and when I arrived, both boys were sitting outside the principal's office, looking more defiant than scared. On the drive home, Terry exploded. "Why didn't you ever tell us the truth?" he yelled, his fists clenched in his lap. "Why didn't Mom ever tell us?" I didn't have an answer. The truth was too ugly, too messy to explain to kids. When we got home, Marcy was waiting at the door, her face pale as she took in Rick's bloody mouth. Terry stormed past her, yelling, "Ask Mom why we had to deal with this. Ask her why she never told us the truth." Marcy just stood there, tears welling up in her eyes, as Terry retreated to his room and slammed the door. Rick didn't seem too upset about his teeth, he was more worried about his brother. I left him watching TV and took him to the dentist, wondering the whole time how we'd finally deal with the truth. When we got back, Marcy was gone. Her car was still in the driveway, but there was no sign of her in the house. Terry said she grabbed her purse and walked out without saying a word. I spent the next week trying to figure out what to do. Her parents and sister refused to speak to me, and there was no sign of her anywhere. It felt like she'd vanished, leaving behind only questions and unfinished conversations. Marcy's disappearance wasn't just a shock, it was a release. For years, we'd been trapped in an uncomfortable limbo, pretending for the boys' sake that things were fine when they clearly weren't. Now, without her there, the house felt lighter, freer. At first, I was angry. She hadn't left a note or given any indication of her plans. Her family refused to speak to me, and I didn't know if she was staying with them or just wandering aimlessly. After a week of silence, I decided I couldn't keep waiting for answers that might never come. Carla moved into the house. It was a big step, but it made sense. She was already a part of our lives, and the boys liked her. To my surprise, they adjusted quickly to the new dynamic. They never called her Mom, they called her Carla, but the respect and warmth they showed her spoke volumes. She brought order and care to a home that had been chaotic for too long. Everything connected to Marcy slowly disappeared. Her clothes, her photos, even the little trinkets she'd collected over the years, all gone. Carla handled it without asking, and I never questioned where it went. I didn't want to know. It was like erasing a bad dream. Months passed, and life found a new rhythm. The boys did well in school, the tension in the house eased, and for the first time in years, I felt like we were a family again. Carla took over the household duties with ease, and even my mother seemed to approve of her, a rare compliment. Still, there were loose ends. After 2 months, I went to the police and filed a missing person report. Officially, it was a runaway spouse case, a formality I needed to pursue divorce proceedings. The law required a year of abandonment to finalize it, so I waited. By the time the paperwork went through, the boys had grown accustomed to our new life. They were thriving, and I wasn't about to let anything disrupt that. When the final decree of divorce arrived, I felt a strange mix of relief and closure. 2 weeks later, Carla and I drove to Elton and tied the knot. It wasn't a big ceremony, just a quiet moment to mark the beginning of a new chapter. We were a family again, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe. Years passed quickly. Terry graduated high school and joined the Air Force. Rick went to a butchering school in Toledo, eventually landing a job at a high-end shop in Westchester. They both stayed in touch, visiting often, and we saw them grow into strong, capable men. Carla and I eventually moved back to Philly. With the boys grown, there was no reason to stay in the old town. Life was good, peaceful, even, and for a while, it felt like the past had finally been laid to rest. But the past has a way of sneaking back into your life when you least expect it. It happened at a wedding. One of Carla's nieces was getting married, and as is the tradition in Philly, the event was huge, hundreds of people, most of them family or family adjacent. It was loud, chaotic, and full of life, just as it should be. Carla seemed distracted that night, her eyes scanning the dance floor. I didn't think much of it until she leaned over and whispered, "Tony, we have a problem." "What kind of problem?" I asked, frowning. She tilted her head toward a table across the room. "Look over there." The woman with the short platinum hair. I squinted, and my stomach dropped. It was Marcy. What the hell is she doing here? I asked, my voice tight. She's with the groom's side, somehow connected to the family. But that's not the problem, Carla said, her voice lowering. Her boyfriend's here too. And they're planning to make trouble. What kind of trouble? They're trying to bait you, Carla said. He's going to insult me, hoping you'll react. When you do, he and his buddies will jump you. I stared at her, incredulous. And what do you expect me to do? Let him run his mouth? No, she said, a wicked little smile spreading across her face. Play along. Let him say whatever he wants, and just agree with him. Keep your cool, and don't let him get to you. I've already spoken to S's guys, they're here, and they'll take care of the rest. Reluctantly, I agreed. Sure enough, a man from Marcy's table sauntered over, grinning like he'd already won. He started throwing insults my way, most of them aimed at Carla. I nodded along, throwing in sarcastic replies that made him angrier. It didn't take long for him and his buddies to follow me outside, where S's guys were waiting. The confrontation was quick and brutal. 3 Louisville sluggers ensured that. I didn't even have to lift a hand. By the time I got back inside, Marcy's table was empty. Carla caught up with me later, her hair slightly mussed but her confidence intact. What happened to Marcy? I asked. She smirked. Gina and I had a little talk with her. Let's just say she won't be causing any more trouble. That was the last time I saw Marcy. Life with Carla continued to get better. The boys grew into men we were proud of, and the past faded further with each passing year. Sometimes I think about the man I was back then, angry, betrayed, lost, and I'm grateful for how far I've come. Marcy may have started the fire that burned down our marriage, but Carla was the one who helped me rebuild from the ashes. And for that, I'll always be grateful.